Welcome to another episode of Great Conversations with me, Nicola O'Donoghue. This week, my guest is an old friend, Matt Radley. We talk about how a passion for history led him on a journey from banking to being a deputy head of an independent school, the importance of values in helping him live a life of purpose. Matt shares his insight and advice on some big issues facing teenage boys today. Think porn and Andrew Tate. Yes, we went there. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed having the conversation with Matt. This is the lovable Matt Radley. Matt Radley, welcome to Great Conversations. How are you?
Thanks for having me on, Nicola. I'm really well, thanks. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it is really nice to see you too. So why don't we kick off by you telling everybody who you are and what you do?
My name is Matt. I am currently the second master, which is the senior deputy head of a boarding school down in the southwest of England. And I've been teaching for 13 years now. I've done a variety of jobs, including head of history department. I've been a boarding house master. And before I was a teacher, I worked in the city for about 7 or 8 years in banking, which I went straight to after university. So about the age of 30, I did a career change, retrained as a teacher, and have been doing that for the last 12 or 13 years.
Gosh, I can't believe it's been that long. And so I'm just really curious, let's go way back when you were younger. And what was it about younger Matt and in your childhood that might have set you on the path and the journey that you're on today?
That's a really interesting question. I think the first thing to say is I never, ever thought I would be a teacher. It was just never part of the plan. I think there were lots of things I thought I might be or I thought I might do. I think my earliest memory of having a career in mind was being a barrister. I thought it'd be really cool to stand up in front of a courtroom and wear a wig and look really grandiose. So maybe there's a part of me which is likes being in front of people and performing, but teaching was never part of the plan. And actually, I think, and talking as someone now who spends a lot of time with teenagers looking at their career choices and where they want to go in life, I was just someone who never had a plan. I was always lucky in that I knew I loved history. That was my passion at school. So I think I knew for a fact that I would go to university and study history. So that was the kind of security blanket going through school of knowing what I wanted to do. But after that, I did have no plan. And maybe we'll come to it in more detail in a bit, but I fell into banking. Just it wasn't an active choice. It just happened. Yeah. So I think in terms of the young me, I don't think I really had a coherent plan. And I suppose maybe what I'm grateful for in retrospect is that I didn't really feel any pressure about that. It didn't stress me out. It didn't cause me anxiety. I was happy just knowing that things would work out in whatever way that the cards chose to fall, and it didn't really worry me too much. So there was no plan, and I think it probably wasn't until I was, I'm going to say, in my late 20s that I started to actually think about what I might actually do with my life.
But it's really interesting though, because whilst there might not have, I guess, in some ways been a concrete plan, it sounds like there was though, because you were pursuing your passion, which was history.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. And there was definitely a part of me that thought I might want to carry on doing that. And I think looking back 20 plus years distance, it is interesting the way in which something so potentially significant as your career and what you end up doing in your early 20s just happened. I, fully aware of my privilege in terms of the university I went to and the fact that the job just seemed to be there. And I know that's not true for everyone, especially nowadays. So I don't say that without taking full stock of the luck I had in that sense. But that being said, I just stumbled into working in the bank in the city, and suddenly blink your eyes and 7 or 8 years has passed. Yeah. And so yeah, I think you're absolutely right that passion was always there, but I don't think anything beyond that was really mapped out until, like I say, I reached my late 20s and I started to think about it a bit more.
It's so interesting, isn't it, how there's all this pressure from such a young age to make decisions. I feel as if we get asked, what do you want to do with your life? And well, it always curious to me now, because it's I'd much rather people have asked me who I want to be rather than what I want to do with my life. Because as you said, I just didn't have a bloody clue. Okay, well, I did a little bit more because I was obsessed with LA law. So I was the legal route. Yeah, it was that was always going to be the route. But I didn't really genuinely know what that meant or what that looked like. And as you say, it's only been years and real life experience and the wisdom that I've gained and working that I've ended up where I have and in a place that's right for me. And it feels like maybe it was an easier time for us. I don't know, because we had more freedom to explore, but there's a lot of pressure, isn't there, at a young age to just know what you want to do?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And I wonder if our generation, that we're a slightly transitional generation, because the generation before us was still probably that generation where you had a job for life. You went and worked for the bank and you worked from the bank until you retired at 65. Yeah. And certainly the generation younger than us now are very much more transient. They might do 3, 4, 5 careers over their time, perhaps. And I think they're much more comfortable jumping between careers than was the case. And we're perhaps somewhere in the middle. So maybe there was that sense of we were emerging from a time when it was expected that you chose your career. And yet by the time our careers came along and we get into our 30s and 40s, the world has changed away from that. So when I changed careers, it didn't feel particularly dramatic, in a sense that no one said to me, "Oh my Lord, you're changing career." Quite a few people said to me, "Why would you want to be a teacher? Don't they earn 12 grand a year?" Which was my banking colleagues' response. But the concept of career change was already starting to become established.
And so, like, when you think back to history was your passion, but then despite that, you went into banking. Talk to me about how that was. You landed up from straight out of uni, having done a history degree, which you loved, in this environment that, well, just I'd love to know a little bit about what that actually was like. You've probably watched Industry. We hear all the stories, but what's the reality? What was it like?
The very short answer as to how it happened is the summer of my second year of uni, I did an internship and I actually applied for lots of different companies and really varied companies, probably reflective of the fact that I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I applied to Ford, the car company. I applied to Barclays, where I ended up going, and Barclays happened to interview me or give me the job first. So I hadn't gone through the other processes yet. So I genuinely stumbled into the Barclays internship. And then at the end of the summer, they gave me a job on their graduate scheme when I graduated. And I remember thinking, this is great because it's a fallback and I'll apply for loads of other things and it's always there in the background. And of course, being a 21-year-old, probably slightly lazy student, I didn't apply for anything else at all and just went into the job when it fell due. So as much as anything is stumbling in, referencing back to my earlier comment around being privileged to have that situation, I did stumble upon it. What was it like? I think, so this was the early 2000s and there was definitely, I think, still the dying days of a slightly kind of work hard, play hard culture. I definitely had a sense of absolutely not on the scale of Industry or anything like that. And I never saw, for example, drug taking, for instance. I'm sure it happened, but it was never around me. I was never aware of that being part of the culture. But I think very much drinking culture was really prevalent.
And you must also remember the bullying and the harassment, because obviously I worked down the road in a law firm, and so it was very similar to what you're saying. There was certainly, from the legal side, like the culture, it was very dog eat dog, abusive, not very uplifting, affirming, very masculine, macho, that linked into that drinking. But unless you were out drinking in the pub with the boys, then you were not really going to be progressing in your career. It was like very much, I felt that from my side. So I don't know if that was the same in the banking industry.
So it's really interesting perspective to have. I can remember when we were, meet up at the time and talk about it, and your descriptions of your working experience felt quite different to mine. And I think there's probably two reflections I have on that. One is looking from the outside into the legal profession at the time. My perspective was there was such a rigid hierarchy and such an established, accepted pattern of behaviour. So when you were a trainee and then a newly qualified lawyer, you were expected to give your pound of flesh because presumably the partners had done that 20 years earlier, and so it's like, well, it's your turn now. And the power of the cult of the partner seemed quite heavily established, and they had this kind of dominant position. And presumably, certainly in 2003-4, they were mostly men. So I suspect that probably was part of it as well. So I think that's my first reflection. The second one, I suppose, probably being more self-aware, is that I probably quite enjoyed that side of it. I enjoyed having a drink. I'm quite tall. I'm quite a physically large white man. I played rugby at the weekends. I suppose in some ways, if you were to draw a caricature of that kind of person, it probably fitted it pretty well. I hope I was nice. You had to ask my colleagues, but certainly in terms of Was I the kind of person who's going to kick against that trend and say, this isn't right?
Yeah.
No, I wasn't. Probably because I wasn't aware it was there, because I was a beneficiary of it. So I think probably I definitely didn't have a sense in my teams where I worked of bullying or of over dominant leaders. I didn't get that as much.
Do you know, Matt, that's so fascinating, because what you're describing, you were part of a system that was designed for you. Like you've just said, the sort of white privileged male, you were flourishing, you were the beneficiary. So then it just makes me even more curious as to what it was about that system then that was designed for people like you to support and elevate people like you, that just, what was it didn't work about that system then? What was it that made you want something different?
It's a really interesting question. How I've always thought about it in my head is that there was a growing, tangible, but not, I couldn't quite put my finger on why, but there's a growing sense I wasn't really fulfilled in what I was doing. So increasingly, the things that I'd laughed off before or just accepted as part of the job, I was increasingly unable to laugh those off. I didn't enjoy it as much. I remember really clearly, I have this very vivid memory of Sunday evenings. I would open a bottle of red wine and I'd sit and watch Top Gear, and I'd get through the bottle of wine in an hour. And I just have this knot in my stomach of just really not looking forward to going to work the next day. It's interesting, actually, even to this day, to 2023, I always use that as a benchmark of where I am currently. The job I do now is in some ways infinitely more challenging than what I was doing at the time, but I've honestly never had Sunday night feeling. I just have never, ever had that. So there was this sense that I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't happy, but I didn't know why. What changed it for me was that I was thinking, what do I want to do? Do I want to go and work in a different bank? Do I want to go and work in a private equity fund? I wasn't thinking particularly outside the box, but I had a friend who worked in the bank with me, and he quit. And then he got a job teaching at a school just outside Oxford. And I used to go and visit him there. I was single at the time. I didn't have any kind of responsibilities. And gradually I got to see what he was doing. And coming back to that kind of history hook, he was also teaching history at the time. And I can remember sitting in a classroom watching him teach a lesson and thinking, how cool is this? You get to stand in front of interested teenagers and talk about something that you love. And I just remember thinking, I caught myself at one point and thought, this is it. This is what I want to do. This is fantastic.
And what was it that you noticed, like in those moments when you caught yourself? What was it that sort of that made you think, this is the path that I'm meant to go on? This is what's next for me?
It was a sense of feeling, I'll do my best to articulate it because it's not something I necessarily have a single word for, but it's a sense of feeling that I was doing the thing that I was destined to be doing, that I was meant to be doing. And I think I can remember when I got my first, fast forward a couple of years, and I got my first actual job, teaching job, I remember almost a sense of being kind of deliriously happy, going, I cannot believe that I'm doing this thing that I love so much. And my wife actually, during that first year of my actual teaching job, we had a conversation one evening and she said, I need to change my job because I look at you and how much it's changed you doing what you're doing now. And I've realized that's what I have to do for myself as well. So I don't mean that in any way about me, but in terms of, I think clearly the impact it had on me was quite dramatic. I'm a unashamed nerd when it comes to history. I love it. And that was part of it. But also I think if you're lucky enough to get real fulfillment from being around children and young adults, there is a real joy in being around that group of person. You get energy from them. You feel like you're making a difference. You feel like you're contributing, you're helping in some way, you're doing something that matters. And I think all those things crystallized into one feeling. I was just in the place I was meant to be.
That's so amazing, because obviously what you're talking about is the power of living on purpose and following that. Like you mentioned it earlier, it was what you were destined to do. And it's really interesting that Sally also commented on that. And I wondered if, when you look back now, what were some of the things that you think were observable about you? Like how different sort of the Matt in banking versus Matt living, I'm going to use the term on purpose because I just love it. But like, what was the difference in terms of just you and the relationships that you had?
Yeah, that's a hard one to look at when you have to be brutally honest about yourself. I think at times I probably wasn't a particularly not pleasant person to be around, but I think I was quite highly strung, I would say, maybe quicker to temper than before. I think I was living that kind of what I'd say London investment banker lifestyle where everything's important, fast, you are the center of the world and things have to work your way and you can bash through things and sort things out because that's what you do. And it's a slightly alpha viewpoint. And I think that I would often use the phrase alpha as a kind of pejorative. I don't think that's a good thing. And I think probably I was living like an alpha male, or thinking I was an alpha male, perhaps, in terms of that slightly dominant. I don't think aggressive. I hope not aggressive, but who knows? But yeah, so slightly alpha in all the negative ways. And I hope, and it's probably been a long journey for me, but I hope that certainly fast forward 12, 13 years, I don't think that's part of my character anymore. Well, I'm sure there are elements of it, but I'm very conscious of them and very keen that they don't become part of my character.
It's so amazing, like what you're talking about as well, how our environment can shape our actions, how I think particularly when we're younger and we're still trying to figure out who we are, we adapt and we play roles and personas, and we take on personas in order to survive and get through and exist within an environment. And the more that you strip back from that and you find yourself and you get onto a path that's got more purpose and meaning and more aligned with who you are, as you say, there's like a softening and there's parts of the personas that sort of fall away as you lean in more to who you're meant to be and how you're meant to show up. Like you don't feel like you need to play anymore. You can just be, because being is enough. And you found the purpose, your purpose in yourself.
Did you find that, because I remember when you left the legal world, was that part of your rationale, your drivers for that?
Gosh, no, it's similar, to be honest, to what you were saying about leaving banking and how narrow I was in my thinking. So I left the legal profession because I just really did not like it. It just didn't fit for me. There was nothing that I aspired to. So even the female partners were so masculine in the way that they showed up. There was nothing about the environment and the work that really lit me up or made me want to dedicate my life to it. It was taking more than it was giving. So I just knew it wasn't the place for me to be. So when I actually left to do an MBA, didn't I? So ironically, to continue learning. And then the idea was to try and figure out what I wanted to do. And it definitely put me on the path that I needed to be on, because obviously from there I went into organizational design. But it's been a journey, but it definitely set me in the right direction, I think.
And I wonder if, I certainly feel that a lot of the things I've been describing so far, I could only say now with hindsight. I don't think for a second that as I was going through the career change or retraining as a teacher, or that I was able to observe these changes in me as they were happening. I think it's only in retrospect I can say that, and I think that's true. So there's a degree to which you have to follow your gut instinct in terms of what you think is right for you, and only once time has passed will you really be able to tell the effect it has on you as a person.
Yeah, I agree. And it's me, why I said earlier about this question of, we ask people what they want to be, we don't ask them who they want to be. And like looking back now, a huge part of what I can see is when I made the right decisions. I'm not sure that there's ever wrong or right decisions. There's lessons to be learned, but the decisions that put me on a more fulfilling path were always driven by my values. But yeah, I didn't know that. I wasn't aware of, if you'd have asked me 20 years ago what my values were and what was important to me, I would not have really been able to articulate that. And they do change as you get older, but the core values don't. And so looking back, when I started to make decisions that were supportive of my values, whether that would be careers or relationships, that's when things started to change. Actually building a more values driven life then put me more on the path to, be more fulfilled and on purpose.
When you talk, I notice you use the word values a lot. And I think that concept of values is really strong for me. I talk to the pupils here, and I hope they listen sometimes, about what are your values. It doesn't really matter what they are to a degree, but it matters that you think about that, because to understand who you are as a person, you have to understand what values you have. And I genuinely don't think until I was probably in my early 30s had I really had that conversation with myself about what matters to me. It only was crystallized when I took over running a boarding house. I decided I wanted to have some core values for the house that I put across to the boys as being what mattered. And so I had to think about what they were. And that was quite an interesting process. And actually I chose 3. And of those 3, one I wish I hadn't chosen in retrospect. I chose adventurous, which there's nothing wrong with being adventurous, but it's not one that really resonates with me. But I also chose kindness and integrity. And so I used to talk all the time. I don't mind if you make mistakes. I don't mind if you mess up, But if you don't show integrity in how you act with people, or if you're not kind, then I've got a real problem, because you understand that those are non-negotiable things.
Yeah.
And more as I've gone through, and actually, as part of my job, I deal with pupils who get things wrong, and my role is such that it's the serious things that come to me. And I always talk to pupils about it's okay to make mistakes. Yeah. We make mistakes as humans. I make mistakes all the time, and it's fine because we learn from mistakes. But I always categorize mistakes into what you might label teenage misadventure, bad decisions, impulsive things that teenagers do. And then you have mistakes that are deliberate kindness or picking on someone or making someone feel bad. And they're two very different things. And I think that comes back to my, what matters to me, what I think are important and my values. And like I say, it wasn't until I was almost forced to by the job I was doing that I started to have that. But I now recognize that's really important to me.
And just as well, 2 questions. First of all, I'd like to know what your third value is now, if it's not adventurous. Also, I'd like to sort of understand more about how they play out in your life now.
Yeah, okay. I think I have quite a clear answer. I think acceptance is probably what I'd say. And I think acceptance probably would have been tolerance a few years ago. But I think increasingly tolerance implies a degree of I'll tolerate you, but I'm not really that interested in it. Whereas acceptance is just accepting people for who they are. And I think for me, more and more as society becomes more and more challenging and polarized and divided, and the impact of social media just exacerbates all those things, that having as your base level that you are accepting of anyone for who they are, whatever that is, it's always been important. And I think it's more important now than ever. And they're all really interesting questions, and they have lots of good answers and varied answers. But for me, I think I used the phrase non-negotiable before with the boys. It's non-negotiable. You just got to be accepting of people, because everyone's different and everyone has value and everyone is their own person. Yeah. And if we can't accept that, then that's where our problem starts. Yeah, acceptance for me.
Oh, Matt, do you know what? Can I just pick up on that? Because I absolutely agree. And it's so interesting that you picked acceptance, because that has been one of the things that has fundamentally changed my relationship with myself. Is self-acceptance. For so many years, I feel as if I was accepting of others, probably to a fault, but I was never accepting to myself. And so it's so beautiful that you bring that in as one of your values, because that's also had such a power in my life, is been turning that acceptance on myself and realizing that I need to love and accept myself before I can do that with anyone else, actually, because I'm only capable of fully accepting people to the extent that I'm fully capable of accepting myself. And that means, exactly to your point, that we're humans and that sometimes we stuff up and we make mistakes and we don't get things necessarily right, or we fail, or we struggle. It's part of the human experience. And to deny that is to, I think I was anyway, denying my own humanity. Like I wasn't accepting of myself because I was not this infallible, perfect being.
It's fascinating. And I think actually, just to pick up that point, certainly dealing with younger people, children, teenagers, young adults, I think in many ways, I feel that it's really imperative that we give them the permission to do those things, because actually you have to be explicit about things like that. We can look back as adults who've got lots of experience of good and bad and indifferent things in our lives. But if you're 15, the power of someone who is in a position of authority standing up and saying, it's important that we accept other people for who they are, but it's equally important that you accept yourself for who you are. And that's not the kind of language that was being used even 10 years ago, I don't think. I feel that in lots of ways, I'm quite a strong believer in the power of language and using the right phrases and words and terminology, because I think it allows access to concepts and thoughts that otherwise might be quite challenging. And so having a shared language where we say, your values are important, acting with integrity is important, accept yourself before you accept other people. Children are bright. They pick things up. Their brains are developing and evolving, and their psyches and their spirits are developing and evolving. And actually, that will resonate with them on different levels and in different ways. But the second question you asked was, how do values play out in my current life? And I think I'd hope, and we could always do things better, and I certainly wouldn't hold myself up as a paragon of excellence at all. But I think if there's one way I try and play it out, is it to be explicit about those things. We shouldn't be ashamed about talking about values or the idea of love, or how you show love or affection or acceptance of other people, or feeling sad, or just being really explicit about concepts and core values as a language of school, not just what date was the Battle of Flodden. It's more than that.
I have no idea.
It's 1513.
Do not ask me that question.
That is interesting.
But here, though, I am just so intrigued by what you're saying, because it's not also language and words that I typically hear from a man, if I'm going to be honest. So just even the fact that I'm hearing you talking about love and acceptance and integrity, it's so refreshing. But with the position that you're in, it's so unique. It's shaping the minds of the future. And like, how, for young men nowadays, I'm just so intrigued, the sort of things that they're faced with, this concept of masculinity. What does it even mean? What is it to be a man? Like the things you're talking about, values, likely a part of that as well, as being in touch with your emotions, showing that you love friends, like as a man, a male, telling their friends they love them and putting their arms around them. Like, it's not traditionally things that you would see. It's why I think, unfortunately, some of the statistics around suicide are so high when it comes to men, to people that identify as males. So yeah, in your role, like, how are you approaching that? What are you seeing? What are some of the things that can, maybe help shape a more healthier definition of masculinity as we go forward?
I think the first thing to say as a baseline, it's important to set the baseline, is that clearly things that are happening in society in terms of sexism, misogyny, domestic abuse, rape statistics, all those horrible things, that's a given. And nothing I will say that follows is intended in any way to trivialize or marginalize that point. But I think in some ways that is an important baseline to set, because I think part of the challenge we have is that at the moment, as a society, we are tackling some really phenomenally difficult, but also ingrained, but also emotionally highly charged themes. But I think the challenge we have, and linking this back specifically to teenage boys, I think, is that in some ways that has been done in a way which has made boys to a degree feel like they're under attack. And I was hoping I wouldn't mention the name Andrew Tate, but I think we have to. And he's, of course, not the only one. He's the most famous of many like that. So he's an example of a wider trend. But why does someone like that have traction? And the question is not, is he right? Is he wrong? Clearly, his opinions are abhorrent and vile. And yet there's lots of teenage boys, young adults who I've spoken to, who I would describe as well-educated, intelligent, thoughtful, brought up, who will defend him, who will say, and the recurrent theme is, he's misrepresented. You, as adults, don't get it, because all you hear is the media's portrayal of him, which is skewed. And they take sound bites, which sound bad, and they make him all about that. And in other words, it's defensive. And so I think perhaps our instinctive reaction is to want to leap in and go, but it's awful. So why are you even thinking like that? That's okay. But my strong sense is that's the wrong approach to take, because you just won't get anywhere.
Well, it's what I think you're alluding to, is the question is more, what does he represent in their life? What is it about what he's saying and offering that is resonating with our young boys? And it's so difficult, isn't it, in this day and age now, with how polarized we have got to in society, like the lack of ability to have discourse, to sit with uncomfortable conversations, to open up these topics that, as you say, are so emotionally charged, and do so in a way where every voice is represented. So how can we create forums and conversations and discourse where we're learning from everybody? I might not agree, and I don't, with a lot of the right-wing views that are out there, the racist, intolerant, religious. It does not resonate with me at all. And yet I do myself a disservice by shutting myself off from that viewpoint and from those individuals, because they are actually reflective of a certain proportion of society. And I'm not learning from that. I'm living in a bubble if I don't acknowledge that these people exist and this way of living exists. And it feels like we're at a sort of similar tipping point with these young adolescent males. They're engaging in this stuff. They're engaging in this right-wing narrative, online porn, whatever else is going on. I don't even want to know. And by trying to pretend like it's not happening, they're just going to dig deeper, surely. Like, we're not really understanding what's going on, like what's lacking in their life that they feel drawn to
That's
this
it.
man and to these things.
And that's it. And how have we got to the point where this person who spouts these pretty vile opinions is their spokesperson?
Yeah.
And I think there's a sense of no one understands us, but he does. That's, I think, maybe oversimplified, but not too much. There's a sense that we have been told that we can't be this and we can't be that, and girls have all these rights and we shouldn't have them. And finally, here's a man who gets what it's like to be us and who's not afraid to speak it, even though it's controversial. And I think that is, in some ways, why boys gravitate towards him. And when you were talking then, you mentioned a few times words like discourse and conversation. And I think that in many ways is a really important part of it, is communicating. A phrase that I often use and talk to pupils here about is we have to focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. There's far more than what brings us together and unites us than there is that separates us. And if we focus too much on what divides us, then we're in trouble. Whereas if we focus on what unites us, then we have a chance. And there's a brilliant TED talk, and I'm afraid I forget the name of the person who did it, but he's an LGBT activist, and his talk is entitled "Empathy is Not Endorsement." And it's I love the phrase because I think it gets right at the heart of great conversations like the podcast. You can talk to someone who you fundamentally disagree with and you can empathize with their point of view. Doesn't mean you're endorsing their point of view or that you're agreeing with it. And yeah, maybe when we get towards some of the really extreme comments around rape or abuse, and then of course we can't empathize with those. But when you have viewpoints that don't accord with your own or that you find uncomfortable, that actually having that ability to step into, I want to try and understand this person, and I'm not going to agree with their views, and I'm not going to change my mind, but I want to understand their perspective, is, I think, something we've lost, whether we ever had it. I don't think we ever needed to have it as much as we do at the moment, because social media has meant every single viewpoint in the world is available immediately online, whereas 20 years ago, you didn't really see those wildly contrasting viewpoints.
Yeah, you did.
And so maybe it's not that we've lost it, it's just we've never had to have it on this scale before. But I think that is the challenge.
Yeah, and it is also about how you show up in conversation as well, isn't it? I think often we default to wanting to help people, to problem solve, to feel like part of a group. And what you're talking about for me is just being able to show up and listen. That's it. You're not about persuading. You don't have to be. Oftentimes we go into conversations, discussions already unconsciously adversarial. I'm going to be right, you're wrong, because to be wrong is, yeah, exactly. And so it's really hard to suspend that and to just be curious and listen and be like, okay, cool, I can hear what you're saying, but like you say, I don't agree with it. There's my boundaries, walking away, but thank you for sharing.
I feel differently to you.
Yeah.
I understand your position. I can never agree with it, but I understand it. And I think with Andrew Tate, what we're trying to do here is to talk to boys. So what are the things that we'd agree on? Are there things he says that we think we both agree are okay? Work hard, take responsibility. Okay, fine, I can live with those things. Are there things that we would both agree are unacceptable? And there's plenty of those things as well. So what's the grey area? What are the bits in the middle that you think are okay that I don't think are okay? And let's talk about those and let's try to understand each other. And I think engagement, discourse without endorsement, I think that's how you will unpack these issues. But the reality is, this takes time, it takes engagement, it takes emotional intelligence on the part of both sides. And I think that's what's difficult, because I don't think necessarily as a society yet we are equipped to deal with the issues that we are creating. I won't go into, you mentioned online pornography. I think that is one of the major problems that we are seeing the manifestation of in terms of treatment of women, perspective of women, male attitudes. That is the real issue, and quicker that governments and world bodies can take action, the better. I think at the moment that is running slightly out of control. And because of the topic, because it's pornography, because it's what it is, I don't think it's being talked about as openly as it needs to be as a contributing factor.
There's huge shame, isn't there, particularly in the British culture around sex. And actually, there's a phenomenal platform. So for people that are interested in watching other people have sex and whatever, I don't even know if you call it porn. Is because I just associate porn with, as you say, like the misogynist mistreatment of women. But for people who like to be voyeurs, for example, so that way, there's a platform called Choose Love Not Porn. and I can't remember the
Okay.
lady's surname, Cindy I can't remember her surname. And that's her whole advocacy and passion and purpose, is to build a community where it's a realistic snapshot. Because as you say, like, again, I think it's such a privilege of our age, is that we grew up where we learned sex through experience. And yes, there was the odd, like, I remember laughing with a friend of just my experience of porn was a VHS video that we put in on the one telly in the room where our friend was at the door waiting sure mum and dad didn't come in. And that was like it, thank God.
So I spend a lot of time with parents. We give parents discussion evenings, and we talk about consent, and we talk about screen time and alcohol and drugs, sex. We talk about pornography. And I think if you are the parent of a 8, 10, 12, 15-year-old at the moment, the pressure on you as a parent to equip your child with the tools they need to navigate the world is really significant, because it's stuff that you didn't have to deal with. As you say, the VHS tape, I can remember the excitement when a friend would have a kind of half rustled copy of a porn magazine in class, and they'd be passing it under the desk. That was the reality. And so the parents are now, that was their reality growing up. So they're having to deal with these things they've never experienced, and yet they are significant in their implications for their children and for society. And I think I get a sense of real nervousness from parents around, how the hell do we deal with this? This is really hard.
I was going to ask you, how the hell do they deal with it? And what advice would you offer to parents that are dealing with all of the issues that we've been talking about?
I think the best advice is that you need to talk to your children all the time about these issues, these topics. But I always use the phrase, have the conversation with them before you need to have it. So that doesn't mean you sit down at the kitchen table and say, Ted, that we're going to have an hour now talking about pornography. It might be 30 seconds in the car. Oh, have you heard of this thing called pornography? What do you know about it? And they might only be 11 or 12. But if you say, oh, yeah, I don't want you to worry about it, but there's this thing, and actually it's made up, and it often can be quite scary to watch, and it's not very nice. You may well see it in the next couple of years in your life. And if you do, I'd love you to come and tell me. We can talk about it and how you found it, but do understand that it's not real and it's not very nice a lot of the time. And then that's it. And that 12-year-old will probably, if you have that conversation a couple of times, the moment when they see pornography for the first time, and they will, maybe on a friend's phone or an older brother or whatever it might be, they will have a framework with which they can manage it. But they'll also know that dad had said, if you're freaked out by that, come and talk to me and we can have an open conversation, and it won't be embarrassing or awkward at all. And I think we probably as parents have to chew down our kind of teeth grinding awkwardness about it, because it's really important that the children don't think you're awkward about it. And the other thing it's really clear whenever you survey children, and they're big surveys in all countries, as much as teenagers don't want to admit it, they, on the whole, still rely hugely on their parents for advice, for guidance, for help, for support. And parents need to remember that just because they might have a huffing, grumpy, kind of hormonal teenager slamming doors and listening to The Cure, it doesn't mean that teenager doesn't need them and actually doesn't value their advice, because they still do. And so I think it's giving parents the confidence to say, you are important to them, but also making sure that the children from a very young age know that their parents will talk about those things and it won't be awkward. And if they ever need help or they're in trouble, all they'll get from their parents is support and not judgment at that point in time. And I think so it's difficult, but also it's easy. You just talk to them, make those conversations really easy and ever present.
Sounds like it's going back to what you said earlier of just society as a whole. We need to get more comfortable with having emotionally uncomfortable conversations. And it's just like the wisdom that you've shared, Matt, is just like unbelievable. I really appreciate it. And
that's very kind of you to say today.
I'm just curious, as you look back with everything that you've sort of gone through and what you've experienced, like, what would you say is the biggest lesson or takeaway that you're bringing into the sort of next chapter of your life, or where you go to from here?
What a good question. I think it's probably learn who you are and what matters to you, and then be true to those things, which I'm being brutally honest. If I'd have heard myself saying that 15 years ago, I probably would have whacked myself around the head with a sledgehammer. But I think it actually is true. Whether it's career or family or children or relationships, you go through difficult things in your life. We do as humans. And unless you are exceptionally lucky, you're not going to have a clean run on all those things. And so when it comes to making decisions about career or family or relationships, whatever it might be, if you know who you are and you know what's important to you, and you follow those as your guiding principles, and then you will come out ultimately in a good place. Doesn't mean you won't have rocky times, doesn't mean things will go smoothly all the time, but it means that you'll end up in the place that's right for you.
Yeah, I agree. Amen to that. So listen, we've got a closing tradition on this podcast. What is something that people value that you don't?
It's a great question. Yeah, I know you've tipped me off about this to give me a chance to think about it in advance, and I needed it because it's a really hard question. I think my answer is the concept of busyness, but particularly the idea of being busy as a virtue. I think we live in particularly Britain I'm talking about. I don't have experience of other societies particularly, but so in Britain we live in a society where I think we still really value the concept of being busy. Busy equals good. Busy equals productive. Busy equals you derive your value and your worth from how busy you are. But I think it's quite a damaging perspective because actually being busy for busyness' sake is very harmful because there's so much we gain from being still, from sitting in the chair and reading a novel, or from sitting in the garden and, I don't know, listening to the birds, or from playing table tennis with your son for half an hour, even though you know you've got to write an email, send it for work, whatever it might be. But I think we need to break out of the sense that busy is good.
I love it.
That's my answer.
I absolutely love it. Matt, thank you so much. I genuinely appreciate you. Thank you so much for giving me your time and for sharing your wisdom. I've loved it. Thank you.
Really good fun talking to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I'd like to thank the humans that make the Great Conversations podcast possible. My editor, Jovan Stojkovski, Jamie Jenkin, who made the lovely music that you're hearing now, and my guests for their willingness to share their personal stories. If you haven't already, please rate and follow the podcast. It's a great way to show your support and allows me to keep bringing on extraordinary guests. Sending you so much love. Bye for now.